It's Thanksgiving and we got a killer deal on celery. We're going to show you 2 ways we can make this last a long time. Hey Provident Preppers, I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Kylie, and we found a fantastic deal on celery. These were only 75 cents, which is normally about half of the price that we would normally have to pay for it. And so this is the time for us to stock up and to preserve it for our long-term storage. And it's actually a really good time because it's Thanksgiving. So we've already harvested almost everything from our garden. And right now, the dehydrator is available and the freeze dryer is available. So what we're going to do is we're going to do this 2 different ways. We are going to freeze dry it, which should have up to a 25-year shelf life, and we're going to dehydrate it, which should theoretically give us about a 10, maybe a 15-year shelf life. But the goal is not actually to let it stay in storage that long, but for us to use this. So this is about what I will need for a year. And so this means that we'll have a fresh supply in there and we just keep rotating through. So let's get busy and get this stuff chopped. We washed all of this really well, and then we cut just the ends off of it. And then we separated the stalks, or each individual rib, each individual rib. And we put all of the leaves and the parts that we really didn't want to cut up into a bowl. And then I blended them in the Vitamix, so that what we're going to do with this is we're going to freeze dry it, and then we're going to turn it into a powder. Like you have onion powder or garlic powder, we're going to make celery powder, which should be super convenient. So we've already put those on those trays. Now, so this was 19 stalks, which is the whole thing, right? Head stalks. We had 19 of them. How much did we end up with here?
Well, like I told you before, I think we ended up with about 4 bowls. But that amounts to about 35 pounds. We did a little measuring, and so we're between 35 and 40 pounds of actual celery here.
And it's beautiful, right? So it's all cut up and ready to go. And what we're going to do, we have both the large freeze dryer and the medium freeze dryer. So we're going to finish filling the trays with everything that we can. And then after we put it in the freeze dryer, we're going to actually blanch the remaining and dehydrate it, because that's what I've done for many years, is just to dehydrate it, and it actually turns out really good. So we'll be right back. Okay, this is what we have all ready to go into the freeze dryer. So we've got the 2 of the pureed celery and 2 of the chopped celery for the medium freeze dryer, and then these 5 trays for the regular freeze dryer. So let's go stick them in. All the celery is in the freeze dryer and ready to go. Now we're going to try something interesting this time, and our dehydrator is right here. Now this would never work during the summertime, because just having both of these going during the summertime is actually too much for the heat in our garage. But it's pretty cold now, and this should work really well. You can see there's all kinds of different sizes of these. Theoretically, you want them all to be the same size, but we had a volunteer army of children helping us chop these, and so this is what it is, and they'll still taste delicious. Okay, now that we've got all those in the freeze dryer, we're going to dehydrate these. Now, dehydrating is a little bit different. I didn't have to do any prep work other than washing and cutting to put the celery in the freeze dryer, but I actually need to blanch the celery before drying, because if I blanch it before drying, it stops the process, and the final product just turns out better. It's a prettier color, better texture, so I like to do that. What I have here is a pasta pot, and normally you just put this pasta in this, right? You pull it out and drain it, but it works really, really well for blanching things. So come on over and I'll show you how I'm going to do that. Okay, so this is my pasta pot, and I just put this in. The water is already boiling, and then I'm just going to let this be here for like 2 minutes, not for very long at all. Stir it just a little bit. Set my timer and watch it work. It's really important that you start with boiling water, because if you put this in cold water and bring it to a boil, it's gonna just end up with a mess. So the water has to be a good rolling boil before you ever put it in there. Okay, this is the beauty of this pot. I can quickly just drain it. And I'm gonna move it over to this to transfer to the counter. And then we wanna rinse it with cold water to immediately stop that cooking process.
Here we are just a few days later, and we've packaged up all this, the dehydrated, the freeze-dried, and some powder. Time to evaluate.
Okay, so celery, it may sound random to most of you, but for me, it is one of the basic necessities for our food storage, because so often when I am cooking basic ingredients such as beans or rice or all of my soups, for example, I have two here that I just made recently. This is a potato soup that we made with leftover mashed potatoes from Thanksgiving, and the base of it is we have some chicken stock, the potatoes, and we have onions and celery, and then some carrots and corn, and that's what it takes to make this, and it's super delicious. But if you don't have the celery, it just doesn't cut it. And then this one is a vegetable chicken one, same thing. I just tossed in some of the dehydrated celery instead of cutting up fresh celery, and it made it quick and easy. Shelf stable wise, dehydrated and freeze-dried celery last a really long time. The dehydrated, not as long, probably 5 to 10 years. And it's really important, so it has to be really low in moisture. It needs to be dry enough that it will snap in order to be put in storage. And then the freeze-dried actually could last up to 25 years when packaged correctly. Now we know why it's important and how long it will last, but how about cost? None of that matters if it doesn't taste good and if it doesn't work well, right? So here we've got the dehydrated celery, and we packaged these a few days ago, and I did have an oxygen absorber in them. Now I've used this twice since it was packaged, and each time I've reclosed it and it has sealed back. Because this is a pint jar and I used a this is a 500 cc oxygen absorber, so it's going to do that for a while before it's actually exhausted. One of the other things that I think is important to point out, as you're looking at these, you'll notice that the dehydrated celery is significantly smaller than the freeze-dried celery. So in this bowl, it looks like there's less, but there's actually more. And we're just gonna pour some hot water over the celery, and while we do our cost comparison, we will let that do its thing. So, Johnny's the numbers man?
Yeah,
This
absolutely.
is his baby.
So we got the little scale out, we've done some weighing, we've compared prices of freeze-dried celery, of dehydrated celery, celery powder, and I figured we have about $180 worth of product here. Now, of course, there are some costs. One-time cost on the jars, the oxygen absorbers, the cost of electricity for the freeze dryer and the dehydrator, those kinds of things, and of course you're going to factor in a little bit of cost for the cost of the machine.
Yeah.
You know, one way or the other. But $180, and you subtract off some costs, we think that's a great savings. Now, there are also some labor costs there. You know, we have to listen to our kids whine while they do this, so there's a cost there. But in my opinion, and maybe it's just the sense of well-being from doing this, is it financially pays off.
Because
this
was $14.86 for all that celery that we bought,
Yeah.
all 19, because we bought it on sale for 75 cents a stock. It was only $14.86.
Right. And that $180 worth of product, that's pretty good, even considering some of the costs that are on our end.
Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the process and how that went. With the celery, with the freeze-dried celery, all we did, we washed it. It's really important that you wash the celery really well. We cut off the top and the end and washed every bit of it really well. And then we pulled off the leaves or the ends that we didn't think looked as pretty, and we put them in a separate bowl. And then we just chopped up the celery. We just sliced it to the size that we wanted, put it on the freeze-dried trays, and put it in the freeze dryer. That is the extent of it. Now with this is actually freeze-dried celery powder or flour. And what I did with that is all those leaves and the ends that weren't quite as pretty, we just put them in the Vitamix and blended it and then dumped it straight onto that freeze dryer tray and freezed it like that. And it actually turned out really beautiful. And you would use this the same way that you use onion powder or garlic powder in things that you really don't care or you don't want the chunks or something you just want the flavor. So I'm super excited about that because it should have a really long shelf life, just like the freeze-dried celery. Now with the dehydrated celery, now I just learned, this is random fact, the difference between dried and dehydrated. Dried are things like raisins that still have a higher moisture content, but dehydrated is a really low moisture content where it's dry enough that you can snap it and it will, or you can bend it and it will snap. It's super important because if you were to put something dried that had a lot of moisture in it with an oxygen absorber, then you could create an atmosphere ripe for botulism, and we don't want that. So these are super dried. Now, so we put them in the dehydrator, and once they were all done, I scraped them all into a big bowl, and I put a lid on it, it's an airtight lid, and I shook it. And then I left it out just on the counter and shook it for a couple of days, just to make sure. It's called conditioning, and it distributes any moisture that's left between all of it, so it really ends up with a better final product. So this one was a little bit more work, but one of the really cool things, the difference is the amount of celery.
Absolutely.
So do you want to explain that?
Well, I don't remember. This was about
these 3 jars.
2/3 of it.
Yeah.
About 2/3 of it is right here, 1/3 of it here. So this stays big and fluffy, so you're not going to get as much in a jar. This is very compact. So, depending, I like the look of this better, but as far as being able to get a lot in a small space, that dehydrated is great.
Right. So it all depends on your purpose, right? And what you're doing. As far as the final product goes, this is just fine in soups and stews and things where you just want that flavor. But if you are going to actually rehydrate it and put it in something like a stir fry, this is not going to be nice. But the freeze dried should be
really,
amazing.
Really good. Yeah.
Now, one of the things that I did want to talk about is how to store this. The reason we have all these in glass jars is because when I use this, I'm only going to use a little bit, and then I'm going to put the lid back on, right? And I want it in smaller quantities so that it stays fresh longer. This is a number 10 can of dehydrated celery, and you can buy them for about $22 a piece now. But if you look in here, this is a whole lot of dehydrated celery. And so when I keep this in my pantry, I put this lid back on, but it takes a long time to go through this, especially considering that if I have fresh celery, I'm always going to use my fresh celery first.
Yeah.
But by putting in these smaller packages, then I can maintain that freshness for a longer period of time. This would be great done in small Mylar bags, but I like the way that this stores on my pantry shelf. But these won't break. You need to protect them from rodents,
Right.
but they're not going to break. So there's
Pluses and minuses both
to
ways.
all of them.
Yeah.
All of them.
Yeah.
So now I think we should see how it rehydrated.
Let's do it.
When we're looking at these, definitely
This
what you
looks
see.
a lot more appetizing.
It does.
This
it
you
really
really
does.
can't tell. I mean, the flavor is going to be there, but it just doesn't look as appealing. And given time in like a hot soup or something, it will come back a little bit closer to its original form. But this is definitely a better looking product right now.
It'll never look like its original form. It's dehydrated. It's kind of the way that it does it, right?
Yeah.
So you still have the bright, beautiful color in the freeze dried. This one, it's darker, and I probably did it just a little bit too long. But remember, with celery, so often what it is you're wanting the flavor in the soup, right? So this still needs to rehydrate for a little while. It's still crunchy. And then this one. So the celery is a little bit sort of
Spongy?
spongy. That's a good word for it. That's a good word for it. Can you tell a huge difference in the flavor?
Not the flavor, no. The flavor's there either place.
Yeah, yeah. The flavor is just about the same. So really, if you're going to use it in some type of soup or as a flavoring, yeah, I don't think it really matters that much, other than the texture. The texture is different. Okay, so now back to cost, because we forgot something in the cost.
Yeah. So, purchasing this out on the market, this bottle would be about $20. And this bottle of powder, celery powder, would be about $26. Normally they're coming in smaller bottles, but the price is fairly high on them. In the case of the dehydrated, we would put these two cans plus these two bottles plus this half, plus one more of these bottles would fit in here, and that's about $22. So it gives you just a little bit of cost comparison there. Obviously getting a lot more product in the dehydrated than you are in the freeze-dried. But you just have to weigh that back and forth and decide what's going to work best for you aesthetically and as far as taste and nutrition.
And financially, right? And financially, because that's really important. So looking at this from this experience for me, because we have the freeze dryer, I would lean more toward freeze drying it. And the reason why is because the process is simpler. All I have to do is cut it up, and you could pre-freeze it. That would be ideal, but I just stuck it in the freeze dryer, and then I didn't have to do anything until it was done, and I pulled it out, put it right in the jars, oxygen absorber, put the lid on, super crazy fast.
Yeah.
And so that would probably be my preference. But either way, celery is a really cool thing to have in your long-term food storage, because it makes all the difference, and it adds some nutrition and spices up your bland beans and rice and things like that. Yeah. Okay, so now for the question of the day.
How do you like your celery? Comment below.
With peanut butter and raisins.
Oh
fresh.
yes, she loves that. Comment below. And thanks for being part of the solution.
Thanks.